A water truck rolled along a ribbon of scorched asphalt, engine coughing up dust beneath a sky that had the color of rust. On paper, it was a simple humanitarian run. Bottles for a Bedouin village, a delivery recorded in neat Arabic on a laminated manifest, a driver who could recite local names and tribal elders. On July 17, 2019, that truck would carry far more than water. It would carry a secret that, if it reached its destination, could have set off a wave of coordinated attacks. And it would bring into being an operation that intelligence officers would later describe as brilliant, and lawyers, rights groups, and some politicians would call into question. Israel's problem was not a lack of satellites, signals intercepts, or drones. It was deliberate human behavior designed to erase itself. Paper and memory, carried by trusted hands. Hamas, for reasons both tactical and paranoid, had shifted portions of its planning offline. Where telephones and email left trails that could be captured by SIGINT, signal intelligence, the organization relied more and more on couriers, people who could ferry written orders, maps, timing, and logistics through the cracks of electronic surveillance. That left Israeli intelligence with a stark choice: wait for a signature on the wire, or go after the carrier. Human intelligence has an old, stubborn logic. Information travels at the speed of whoever is willing to risk their life to move it. A courier moves slowly, deliberately, but invisibly. A courier moves where machines cannot. The harder an intelligence target is for the listening posts to hear, the more the spies must reach, touch, and intercept. That requires being there in person, sometimes in places where states do not want to be seen. The Sinai Peninsula is one of those places. It is the liminal margin between Egypt and Israel, a landscape that punishes haste and rewards local knowledge. Sparse checkpoints punctuate long stretches of road. Bedouin encampments settle in the folds of dunes. And the legal map is a patchwork. Jurisdiction belongs to states, allegiances to tribes. Crossing into Sinai from the Gaza side was always logistically fraught. Crossing across Sinai toward Rafah or Rafah, the narrow blur of a name that, on maps, looks like a sleepy border crossing, but in practice is a knot of politics, meant negotiating Egyptian sovereignty and the mood of local communities. Israeli intelligence learned that a trusted courier named Ahmed Zahran was moving plans through Sinai toward the West Bank. According to sources tied to the operation, the documents described an interwoven set of operations: coordinated disturbances, vehicle-borne threats, logistics chains that could facilitate attacks across several locations. The material was physical: maps, lists, timetables, names. If it reached the wrong hands, people could be killed. The dilemma that sprang from that knowledge had three parts. First, catch the courier. Second, do it in a way that would not tip off the broader network. Third, do it without touching Egyptian sovereignty, or at least do it in a manner that could be plausibly explained. Direct action across borders invites international fallout. Pulling off an interception inside Egypt or Jordan could unleash diplomatic consequences that might ripple far beyond any single disrupted plot. The decision that followed was surgical and morally thick. A cover story. Not a flimsy prop, but an operational construct built to stand up under inspection. Not every cover is merely deception. Some are hybrid, a real activity encased around a false one. This one would be a real humanitarian effort with a layer of clandestine purpose beneath it. Thus was born, on paper and in tense rooms where the clock mattered more than decorum, the Clean Water Initiative. The name was unremarkable by design. It sounded like hundreds of legitimate NGOs that shuttle supplies across borders. Its documents were plausible. Its bank accounts, expertly constructed but not ostentatious, traced a path of small donations and modest grants. Operatives acquired a proper water truck, an old behemoth with dents softened by years of use, a faded logo on its side, and a hydraulic system that rumpled the road with heavy breathing. Concealment did not mean retooling the truck into a false beast. It meant creating places within it where paper could lie unnoticed and where a human could be hidden for a time if necessary. Hidden cavities were installed in structural spaces. a false panel behind a water pump, a cavity under the main storage tank. The work was precise and discreet. Photographs were taken, manuals studied. Every alteration was tested under the sun to ensure it would not betray itself to the touch of a curious mechanic. David and Eaton were the two men chosen to carry that cover into the world. In operational terms, they were Mossad officers, practiced, methodical, fluent in the tradecraft of appearing ordinary. Outside the office, they were introduced as humanitarian workers. That was not a lie devoid of truth. They learned to pump municipal water tanks for villages, to distribute jerry cans and water filters, to talk about drought and hygiene with the blunt empathy of people who had done it before. Humanitarian delivery was part of the playbook not only to legitimize their presence, but to root them in a network of locals whose trust could be leveraged and whose awareness could provide natural camouflage. There are moral lines even in deception. The operatives were trained to maintain the delivery mission. David and Eaton spent days learning local routes, the cadence of merchant markets, the names of tribal sheikhs. They carried not only staged manifests, but actual boxes of bottled water, hoses, and filtration tablets. In a modest Bedawin settlement, a man named Hassan would later recall real water arriving on an afternoon when wells ran low. Those who saw David and Eaton in the villages afterward remembered helpful hands, nothing more suspicious than that. The cover had to be real enough that locals would accept it, and thus, in places, it became an ambiguous hybrid, legitimate assistance used to permit a covert goal. Training went beyond social fluency. David and Eaton rehearsed small humiliations, the customs questions, the casual searches at checkpoints, a pretend engine sputtering on a lonely road. They learned the right phrase to invoke when a guard asked for papers, the name of the program, the grant number, the local coordinator's father's name. Eaton, whose specialty leaned toward technical matters, memorized the truck's mechanical idiosyncrasies so he could plausibly troubleshoot a breakdown. David practiced neutral facial expressions for when a stranger asked where they were headed. They rehearsed in a simulator built from dirt roads and improvised petrol stations. They practiced the choreography of a staged breakdown until their movements were muscle memory. Intelligence had narrowed Ahmad's likely route through a blend of tradecraft. Human from a paid informant, his identity shielded in official accounts for safety reasons, reported habitual times and the preferred path. Satellite imagery had layered moving dots, trucks, the slow crawl of vehicles across sand, a particular pattern of stops that suggested familiarity with certain wells and outposts. Signet was thin. The Courier system aims to evade it. So agents shifted to old tools, observation, stakeouts, and the patient mathematics of timing. They mapped every alternative path, every seasonal waterhole that might slow a convoy. They plotted where an interception could be achieved with minimal attention and maximum safety. The operation required precision. It was not enough to stop Ahmad and seize documents. They needed to do it in a way that suggested nothing amiss beyond a routine traffic problem. Any use of overt force on the road would risk a firefight, a spilling of blood, and, perhaps worst of all, the scattering of the network the way startled birds scatter their flock. For weeks they monitored, they tweaked, they imagined contingencies. David took an extra look at his cover dossier on the night before the planned interception. The dossier was a small, thick folder with laminated scans of bank slips, a photograph of a grant letter in Arabic, and notes about previous water runs. He had learned to be patient with papers. Papers in this world could be more damning than a gun. A photograph could demonstrate delivery. A ledger could show a pattern. Documents were both the currency and the hazard of clandestine work. Eaton checked the truck again at dawn. He crawled into tight spaces to ensure the false panels did not creak. He tightened bolts and tested the hydraulics.
Inferred reconstruction. An operative like Eaton would have also double-checked emergency medicine in the vehicle, sedatives to calm a captured suspect for safe transport, according to the transcript's references to sedation in the custody phase. Yet the exact medical materials and dosages remain classified and are therefore presented here as reported practices rather than direct documentable fact. The operations planners always considered the humane and the pragmatic in tandem. A sedated detainee minimizes risk of injury during a long transit, but sedation also raises ethical questions and medical liabilities. On July 17, 2019, the Clean Water Initiative truck left the staging point just after dawn. The heat was already rising off the tarmac like breath from an iron wound. David and Eaton drove in convoy with a decoy vehicle. Their route wound through the skeletal outskirts of settlements and along a quieter secondary road that shadows the main highway. Ahmad was expected to travel between points on a timetable that the informant had given. A midday crossing point near a remote cluster of Bedouin huts, then onward toward the Rafah axis. Waiting is the agent's companion. For 3 days they sat in a makeshift observation post, a ruined shack with its plaster peeled like old skin, and watched for the brief and ordinary signatures of movement that might signal Ahmad's arrival. The men took turns dozing in the back of a van, binoculars trained on the horizon. Small private rituals held them steady. A cigarette stubbed just so, a half-eaten sandwich saved for a hard hour. Time stretches when you are trying to trap a moment. Each passing car is a potential deception. The reconnaissance team used an array of tools: a low-orbit satellite feed refined into an animated map, a drone that hummed ghosts of its presence when the wind was low, and the more human sensors, the eyes of Bedouin shepherds who could be paid for routine observations without knowing what they watched. Signals came in small packets: a dust column on the North Road at 11:12 a.m., a motorcycle that crossed a checkpoint at 12:03 and then vanished behind a dune. The team narrowed and confidence hardened into a plan. The staged breakdown was old spycraft. Create a plausible mechanical problem that requires assistance and, at the right moment, convert the charitable stop into an arrest. Eaton had practiced mimicking a radiator leak, a flat tire, a hiccup in the fuel injection. He placed a small sabotaged hose so that steam would billow when the truck stopped. The choreography needed to be simple enough to avoid suspicion, yet specific enough to produce the precise pause they needed on a stretch of road with a blind curve and a single sidetrack. A place where 5 minutes of delay could mean the difference between capture and compromise. At 12:37 p.m., the truck coughed to a halt. The heat wrapped around the chassis like a blanket. David, in a tone of frustrated relief, addressed the passing drivers in Arabic. "We must wait for a tow. The pump failed." It was the kind of roadside line you hear from any weary driver. The timing was crucial. Ahmad's work was methodical. Couriers prefer routine. He would stop for a moment at the roadside nudge where the road offered shade, to adjust straps, to take a cigarette out of the same pocket. He would not expect trouble where water trucks stopped. Ahmad approached in a battered pickup. He was not a celebrity or a hardened man of legend in the operational dossier. He was, per the official files, a courier who had carried crucial material over time. He stepped from his vehicle with the gait of someone used to sun and gravel. He looked the truck over with the casual disinterest of a man who had known many breakdowns. Someone in uniform, the men presented as aid workers, offered a hand to help. David greeted him, soft and competent. The moment stretched. Then, as if cued by a director invisible to the roadside, action snapped into place. Easton flicked his jacket to reveal the muzzle of a weapon hidden beneath canvas. Another operative, previously bunched near a sack of filters, produced restraints. There was no gunfight. There was no long argument. The operatives moved with a cold and practiced efficiency. Hands were taken, wrists folded, a hood put on quickly to minimize recognition out of concern for the broader network. Ahmad's eyes, as some later reports would note, were alert to the last beat. His body did not resist catastrophically. The seizure was surgical. The truck was searched. The discovery of concealed documents was immediate and decisive. Under the false panel, in folders wrapped with plastic against humidity, were maps annotated with timings, lists of materials, and a series of hand-scrawled notes that tied movements in the West Bank to logistical support.
The papers were not just tactical sketches. They represented a connective tissue of planned action. The intelligence value was enormous. According to the operational readouts, the documents alone were enough to initiate preventive measures that would stop some planned activities. But these papers were merely the opening door. The most valuable information is often in the mouth of the one who carried it. At that point, the operation faced a critical set of choices. A captured courier can be an information seam that loosens under proper pressure. He can be dangerous in silence, he can be a key if he cooperates. But how to transform capture into intelligence without producing a scene, without creating a public incident along a dusty road where who noticed what is a hazard? The operatives chose a course that combined immediacy with concealment. They sedated Ahmad for transport. Here, the record becomes careful.
The transcript of the operation indicates that sedation was administered as part of the custody phase. It does not provide a medical log, nor does it supply the names of the drugs or their doses. Where reports speak of sedation, they emphasize the operational rationale, to prevent injury during a long transit through rough territory and to reduce the risk of a spontaneous disclosure to passersby. However, sedation raises questions. Medical interference in detaining a detainee shifts responsibility. It creates a duty to care even as it provides control. The presence of sedatives and their use would later be a focal point in debates over the operation's legality and ethics. For now, it served the narrow goal of safe movement. The team concealed Ahmad beneath layers of the vehicle's modified compartments and in an unmarked support van. The false panel that had housed the documents was reconfigured to appear intact. The scene of the roadside problem was made to look like a routine mechanical failure for any passing official who might recall the truck later. The team took care to erase obvious signs of seizure. No blood, no shouting, no long trail. The capture's outward appearance was the normal tale of roadside misfortune. Internally, it was anything but. Extraction across Sinai is a logistical and diplomatic ballet. The region is not just a landscape, it is an overlay of political sensitivities. Crossing toward the Rafah crossing posed the risk of encountering Egyptian security forces whose cursory interest could turn into a diplomatic incident. The operation's planners had prepared contingencies. Prefabricated explanations, plausible chain of custody documents, and a limited window for transit that presumed cooperation or, at worst, an absence of close inspection. The rationale, as framed by those involved, was the immediacy of risk. The intelligence was time-sensitive enough that delay could translate into lives lost. Inferred reconstruction. The convoy took a low-visibility route, one traced in satellite feeds and footnotes, moving under cover of routineness. Where actual state borders exist on maps, operational lines bend in practice. Sometimes trucks head to an agreed safe zone near an official crossing. Sometimes they move to a shadow corridor used for decades by merchants and smugglers. The team preferred routes with minimal official scrutiny at that hour. At the Rafah crossing, legal reality tightened its grip. The crossing itself is a choked artery, where customs, political will, and the spectacle of people moving for work and family create a complicated theater. To get Ahmad across, into custody in Israeli hands, required timing and an assumption of temporary permissiveness or a failure of scrutiny in the busy flow of mundane crossings.
The convoy arrived with cover paperwork, with explanations that would be plausible to the eye of the distracted official. A delivery of water to a village, delayed by mechanical failure but now resolved. Recorders of events note that the team used a pretext of humanitarian delay to justify the convoy's presence at the crossing. Whether Egyptian authorities noticed the detainee in transit remains unclear. Official accounts do not supply a public statement, and no formal protest was recorded in public documents connected to the operation. Where the transcript leaves gaps, this account will flag them as indefinito, unresolved in the public record. Once across, Ahmad was transferred into a secure custody chain. The documents from the truck entered an evidence process that, in the operational lexicon, aimed to preserve chain of custody and prevent contamination. Evidence rooms, forensic scans, and translation teams were mobilized. Analysts, a mix of operational officers and linguists, began to read the handwriting, trace the signatures, map the routes detailed on the folded sheets. Each annotation in Arabic revealed nodes of activity and the names of local facilitators. Where names appeared, analysts cross-checked them against existing watch lists. Within hours, preventive measures, arrests, checkpoint changes, tactical redeployments in the West Bank were implemented based on what the documents suggested. But documents alone, for those in the intelligence profession, are a surface. The deeper intelligence often arrives through conversation, sometimes voluntary, sometimes compelled. The custody and interrogation phase is where the operation shifts from seizure to exploitation. Here the record grows both consequential and contested. According to official summaries tied to the operation, interrogators extracted from Mossad not only confirmation of the material's intent, but additional revelations that were not present on the physical pages. Names of logistic contacts, addresses used for safe storage, short-term caches, and an evolving timeline for attacks. That intelligence, the summaries assert, allowed authorities to disrupt planned operations in time. How was that information obtained? The transcript is precise in one narrow field. Questioning occurred after the arrest and initial analysis of the documents. It also references sedation and intensive debriefing during the custody period. It does not provide explicit descriptions of any coercive physical methods. It does not list techniques. Where later commentary would use the word torture in headlines and in some public condemnations, the available internal documents prefer language like intensive interrogation, pressure interrogation, or enhanced questioning. These are technical terms that spark political and legal debate. For the purposes of this narrative, the claim that coercion or torture took place must be framed as alleged and controversial. Some sources familiar with interrogation practices described the pressure as intense and the tactics as aggressive. Rights groups would later allege that methods crossed legal and moral boundaries. Those allegations remain contested. Interrogation is a moral sparring ring. On one side stands the utilitarian argument. In a democracy that holds the safety of civilians paramount, extracting life-saving intelligence can justify methods that are otherwise improper. On the other stands the rule of law. Legal and ethical constraints exist precisely because the state that breaks its own rules undermines its legitimacy and risks grave moral harm. The Mossad case would become a flashpoint in this argument. Defenders pointed to disrupted plots and lives saved. Critics pointed to questions about evidence, treatment, and the precedent set when humanitarian cover is used as a tool. There is a human dimension in every tactical report that sometimes gets lost in strategic summaries and legal briefs. David, after the operation, found himself thinking about the Bedouin children who waved as the truck left their encampment the week before. He remembered an old man named Omar who had offered a prayer for safe travel. For all the cold calculations and contingency plans, there remained a residue of disquiet. The truck that delivered water also carried the risk of endangering the very civilians who had accepted its aid. Etan, quieter and more technical, had a different kind of weight. He had joined the operation not because he loved secrecy, but because he believed prevention mattered. When asked years later by colleagues what he felt in those moments, he would be laconic. A sharp focus tempered by a steady undercurrent of doubt. The tradecraft demanded detachment and empathy in equal measure, and neither was absolute. Across the line, Hamas reacted to the disruption in predictable and unpredictable ways. Within days, according to intercepted communications and subsequent open-source reporting, the organization initiated a security review. Couriers were called back, routes were altered, trusted chains were questioned. The capture of Mossad was not merely an operational failure for them, it was a systemic vulnerability exposed. For Mossad and other Israeli agencies, the playbook seemed vindicated. The risk had been calculated, the hit executed, the threat mitigated. Yet for humanitarian workers, for legal scholars, and for communities that depended on neutral aid, a different narrative took hold. that the misuse of a humanitarian cover could corrode trust and make life harder for those who truly needed help. This tension between operational success and ethical price is the knot at the center of the story. It is not a simple trade of goods and bads, it is a layered calculus. The operation prevented plots that, if executed, would have harmed civilians. It also created potential diplomatic headaches, and it introduced spectral doubts about the sanctity of humanitarian neutrality in conflict zones. Aggressive lines of intelligence work can be a shield for the state, but they can also function like a corrosive salt on relationships that are slow to repair. By the time David and Eaton's unit completed the extraction and Ahmad was lodged in secure custody for interrogation, analysts were mapping preventive actions across the West Bank. Arrests were made at night in several locations where the documents had pointed. Checkpoints were reinforced. A supply cache found in the vicinity of one of the names on the papers contained materials consistent with preparatory acts. Those items were cataloged and rendered harmless. The immediate operational objectives were met. The long-term consequences, diplomatic, legal, ethical, were unresolved. There was also a quieter casualty, the image of humanitarian neutrality. Once intelligence services demonstrate that aid operations can be used as cover, real NGOs worry that their work will become suspect. Aid workers face new danger in the field when men in khaki are revealed as spies. In the weeks after the operation, humanitarian organizations operating in border regions reported increased suspicion from local communities. Some local leaders refused water deliveries or demanded to see credentials they once accepted without question. The Clean Water Initiative's manufactured paperwork, while operationally useful, bled into a broader reality. In conflict zones, lines between assistance and espionage can blur, and that ambiguity can cost lives. Legal scholars would later debate the operation in law journals, op-eds, and academic forums. They would ask, on what legal basis may a state operate outside a neighbor's sovereign territory? When does the imperative to prevent harm override respect for international boundaries and for due process? They would also examine the nature of evidence obtained under pressure. If an interrogation yields intelligence that prevents an attack, should the method of acquisition retroactively validate the method? The questions were not merely rhetorical, they would form the skeleton of public debate for months to come. For now, in the immediate aftermath, the men in the operatives wing of the intelligence community returned to ordinary rhythm: debriefs, technical assessments, consolidation of lessons learned. They cataloged every decision in internal reports, annotating success and failure. The truck's false panel became a teaching artifact: how the cavity had been constructed, how it had been accessed, what could have been missed. The capture of Ahmad became a case study in the tactical manual of an agency that has always balanced stealth and overt strength in uneasy measure. Yet an operation is never only a chronology of action. It is also a moral theater in which ordinary human faces appear under extraordinary pressure. Ahmad, the individual at the center of this episode, was more than a label in a file. He was a man whose choices and loyalties had steered him into a role where capture meant exposure. The record that follows in later sections will address his interrogation and the intense controversy around it. Allegations of harsh methods, the disputed nature of what was done and why, the legal and ethical fault lines. At this point in the story, those elements are just beginning to thicken. 3 days of waiting had hardened into a single decisive moment on a blistering July day. 1 minute changed trajectories. A set of papers in a false cavity became the hinge upon which a campaign of prevention turned. The operation's immediate tactical goals were achieved. A courier stopped, documents seized, plans disrupted. But the broader consequences, the questioning of humanitarian neutrality, the legal queries about cross-border action, and the allegations that would later swirl about the nature of Ahmad's interrogation remained unresolved. If you want the full inside story, the interrogation, the legal debates, and the human costs, keep watching. The convoy slipped back from the crossing. The truck that had carried Miracle and Menace was driven under cover into a secured compound where evidence rooms had already been prepared.
Analysts began their work in earnest, turning ink and paper into patterns and maps. Custody protocols transferred Ahmad to a secure facility where debriefing teams stood ready. At this junction, the operation moved from the field into the quiet, fluorescent-lit rooms where intelligence is wrung from the human mind. There, the narrative turned inward, toward questions that have no easy answers. What methods are acceptable when time is short and the stakes are high? How does a democratic state reconcile the urgency of security with the constraints of law and human rights? In the coming hours, agents confronted those dilemmas in real time. They were not merely performers in an operation. They were actors whose choices would ripple across the lives they sought to protect and those they had detained. Beyond the walls, the Bedawin who had seen the water truck drive off felt a subtle shift. A leader named Karim, who had once praised the arrival of clean water, later said, in a recorded interview with an aid group reconstructing events, that the community began to ask different questions about foreigners who appeared with help. Suspicion, once planted, is slow to die. The moral calculus of the operation would reach into that village as surely as it reached into back offices and legal libraries. Inside the secured facility, Ahmad was awake, disoriented from the sedatives that had eased his journey. He was questioned first about the documents, about names and times, about whether the notes in his handwriting corresponded to a larger plan. Analysts pushed for clarity. The clock, in many ways, continued to tick. The eidetic detail of the paperwork was a skeleton. His answers, voluntary or coerced, might provide the muscles that made the plan move. Although part of the record asserts that interrogation produced actionable intelligence beyond the paper trail, the exact nature of the techniques and the moments of revelation remain contested in public accounts. Allegations would later surface that the interrogation involved intense pressure and methods that some argued crossed legal boundaries. Others in the security sphere defended the questioning as tough but lawful, pointing to the lives potentially saved as justification. For now, the scene in the interrogation room is a hinge between two narratives, the one that praises decisive intelligence action and the one that warns of erosion in moral and legal standards. As the first night after the capture settled, the operation's immediate ripple effects were visible across several maps. In the West Bank, police and military units acted on the new intelligence, executing carefully planned arrests and foiling storage sites. In Gaza, Hamas tightened internal security, recalling couriers and temporarily suspending certain lines of communication. In diplomatic rooms, whispers began, queries about jurisdiction, murmurs about what might be disclosed if allegations of mistreatment gained currency. The next days would be crowded with press statements, denials, and opaque official language, the usual instruments of states walking a tightrope between transparency and necessity. But those next days lay ahead. For the moment, the scene closed on the small realities: a water truck with a faded logo, a pile of documents in a secure evidence room, an operative who could not help thinking of the faces of the villagers who had welcomed him, and a detained courier who would, over the coming hours and days, be the focus of interrogation that some would later call controversial. An operation that started with the practical goal of stopping a plot had become, by the end of its first chapter, a case study in complex moral arithmetic. Prevention had been achieved. The cost was less visible and far more complicated. The story was not yet done. The interrogation was about to begin, and with it would come the contested claims that the rest of this account will examine: what was said, how it was obtained, and what it means for the fragile boundaries between security and human rights. The fluorescent hum of the interrogation suite swallowed the last of the day's heat. Papers from the truck lay on a long table under a lamp. Their edges had already been lifted into the light of analysts and translators. Ahmad sat on a narrow chair. He was groggy from sedation, pale at the lips, his wrists marked where restraints had been briefly used during the transfer. The room was meant to produce clarity, the ink on the page, the recollection in a man's memory.
What followed would determine whether those pages alone were enough or whether the answers in a man's speech would be the key to stopping plots that, if realized, might have cost lives. The first hours after capture are always chaotic. Medical staff attended to the obvious needs. A linguist read aloud from the confiscated notes while an analyst compared names against databases. Interpreters filtered questions into dialects and back into analytic language. The initial line of questioning focused merely on what was physically in the truck, who had signed for the packages, where the papers originated, whether the courier had a handler in the West Bank or in Gaza. Ahmad answered, at first, with the minimal economy of a man who has rehearsed plausible ignorance. Then, according to the operational summaries, he began to unravel, not immediately and not without pressure. What constitutes pressure in a lawful interrogation is disputed. For many agencies, the lawful exercise of interrogation includes a calibrated range of psychological tools: confrontational questioning, sleep management, strategic presentation of evidence, and the careful use of rapport building. For others, the use of such tools shades into coercion. In the accounts that emerged around Ahmad's case, the dominant verbs were repeated questioning, isolation, persistent confrontation with evidence, and, as the transcript records, sedation at points to manage transport and compliance. Human rights advocates later characterized some of the reports they reviewed as indicating intensive or forceful methods. Internal accounts and defenders described them as rigorous and time-sensitive debriefings. The line between aggressive interrogation and torture in public debate is as much political as it is legal. Whatever the tactics, the intelligence that followed was consequential. Over the next day, Ahmad supplied, under interrogation, names and locations that were not written in the files recovered from the truck. He gave up the existence of a small chain of safe houses on the West Bank's periphery, the identities of several logistics facilitators who supplied vehicles and fuel, and a timetable that suggested a narrow window in which movement and material accumulation would peak. This additional information, the analysts contended, allowed security units to act. Arrests were staged overnight, caches were located and disarmed, and checkpoints were temporarily reinforced on routes identified in the notes and the man's testimony. Those consequences were immediate and dramatic. In one operation, a planned vehicle-borne threat was intercepted when units that had been alerted by the intelligence stopped a truck at a late-night checkpoint and inspected a concealed load consistent with preparatory materials. In another instance, men named by Ahmad were taken into custody and, during follow-up searches, found to be in possession of documents matching nomenclature from the seized folders. A single operation of concealment rippled outward to complicate the lives of those whose work was genuinely humanitarian. Hamas's reaction was also methodical. Internal reviews, some inferred from subsequent changes in courier procedures, suggested the organization moved quickly to tighten operational security. Couriers were rotated more frequently. Routes were altered. Paper trails were purged or minimized. Where documents remained necessary, they were stored in smaller, more ephemeral forms. The capture of Ahmad demonstrated a vulnerability in the courier model. Humans could be seized, coerced, or broken. Documents could be found. For groups that rely on physical transmission to avoid electronic detection, the risk-reward calculus shifted overnight. These adaptations reveal a broader point about the evolving warfare between concealment and detection. For decades, intelligence agencies and clandestine planners have engaged in a game of leapfrogging. One side invents a new method of secrecy, the other invents a way to pierce it. The move toward couriers reflected a tactical response to the age of ubiquitous electronic surveillance. The counter-move, elaborate human infiltration under the guise of humanitarian work, exposed both the ingenuity and the moral ambiguities that define modern espionage. Profiles of the participants deepen the human texture of the story. David, in private memos, reconstructed here from interviews and operational notes, had been selected for the operation precisely because he could pass as both a technician and an aid worker. His fluency in local dialects, his patience in long interactions with community leaders, and his capacity for quick decision-making made him effective. But success left residues.
Evenings when he would stare at his hands and recall the faces that waved as the truck left. Small acts of conscience that have no operational metric. Eaton, the technician, lived with a different burden. His expertise, the false panels, the camouflage, the logistics, was a craft. Every screw tightened was a promise that the trick would remain hidden. After the operation, he too wrestled with second-order consequences. The knowledge that tactical success might transform an entire sector of humanitarian work. Reconstruction of a Bedouin vignette, representative. Karim, a village elder, remembered the truck's arrival the week before the capture. He had stood in the sun and watched men hand out filters and jerry cans. "They saved us water that day," he said, in accounts gathered later. But when talk of the operation surfaced in conversations, he and others confessed hesitancy. "We do not know who comes with help," he told a journalist. "When help brings secrets, what do we do?" Such questions are not easily resolved. They cut to the heart of trust, a fragile currency in places where supplies are scarce and suspicion is high. At the operational level, internal after-action reports mined every decision for lessons. How had the operatives balanced the hygiene of cover and the hygiene of evidence? Was the sedation necessary and proportionate? Were the contingency plans for cross-border movement robust enough? The answers informed doctrine. Future operations would refine the use of hybrid covers, integrate more robust legal oversight, and tighten medical protocols for detainee treatment. These procedural changes, however, did not fully address the normative critique. Should intelligence services use humanitarian cover at all? Ethicists and human rights practitioners framed that question starkly. One line of reasoning held that the use of humanitarian cover imperils neutral actors, and that, by eroding the separation between aid and espionage, states risked making civilians and aid workers targets. The counter-argument noted the asymmetry. Non-state actors plot violence that harms innocents. Intelligence services have a duty to prevent such harm, and sometimes only deception can produce the information necessary to do so. Both perspectives rest on moral axioms, the sanctity of humanitarian space and the primacy of civilian protection. They cannot be reconciled easily. A pragmatic observer might offer a different calculus, weigh the immediate lives saved against the potential long-term harm to humanitarian access. But even a pragmatic calculation must contend with intangibles. What is the cost of a single destroyed well? What is the value of a village that refuses outside help because it fears infiltration? Operational success that saves dozens of lives stands against the erosion of aid networks that could imperil hundreds over years. The trade is not purely arithmetic. It is moral and political. A further set of consequences concerned accountability. Allegations of mistreatment attached to the interrogation of Ahmad demanded inquiry. Some human rights organizations called for independent investigations into whether interrogation crossed legal lines. Governments that practice oversight of intelligence work face a dilemma. Transparency risks exposing methods and operational secrets. Opacity invites accusations of impunity. In democracies, the balance leans towards some form of accountability. Parliamentary oversight committees, judicial review, internal inspectorates, but the degree and depth of scrutiny vary widely. The operational office that orchestrated the operation sought to defend the tactical choices without enumerating methods. Its public posture emphasized results: plots disrupted, caches found, lives spared. Behind closed doors, however, there were memos that noted the legal ambiguities and recommended tighter controls for future uses of humanitarian cover. The dichotomy was stark. Public-facing narratives focused on prevention. Internal deliberations focused on doctrine and legal risk. The media, when it turned to the story, amplified the most provocative line: torture. Headlines framed the issue in blunt terms, relying on activist claims and leaks from unnamed sources. Those who produce headlines know that a single word draws attention. Those who defend institutions know that disputed terms can inflame politics. For careful observers, the correct posture was nuance. Acknowledge assertions, verify claims, and separate proven facts from allegation. The transcript and available records supported some factual claims: sedation, intensive interrogation, documents seized, plots disrupted, while leaving others unresolved: the precise character of coercive techniques, the account of medical supervision during sedation, and affirmative statements by foreign authorities. Thus, the charge that Mossad tortured a courier for Hamas secrets must be read with a careful eye. It captures the controversy in public perception, but overstates what is established in the public record. The term torture in this context is contested. Many of the details remain legally and evidentially indefino. Looking outward, the incident influenced adversaries' behavior. Hamas, in public and private adjustments, moved to minimize similar vulnerabilities. International aid groups redoubled efforts to reassure populations and to demonstrate the independence of their operations. States that monitored the situation adjusted their own countermeasures and legislative oversight, engaging in quiet conversations about boundaries for covert action. The incident became a touchstone in debates over modern intelligence practice: how to balance necessity and legality, efficacy and morality. In classrooms of counterterrorism courses, students now study the operation as a case. The use of hybrid cover, the decision calculus to intercept a courier abroad, the extraction logistics across politically sensitive borders, and the moral dilemmas attached to interrogation. In law forums, the Ahmad case is cited as a cautionary example of the risks when operational exigency outpaces legal clarity. In aid organizations, it is used to illustrate the fragility of trust and the importance of transparent community engagement. For David and Eaton, for all the technical success, the operation left marks that were less tactical and more existential. They returned to routines, to debriefs, and to training the next cohort of operatives. But those who have served in such operations sometimes speak afterward of a quieter metric: the weight in the chest when you look out across a landscape and see children who might no longer wave freely at a passing truck. It is not a metric that appears on spreadsheets. It is a moral ledger that accrues quietly. In the larger arc of intelligence history, the episode sits among many that force the question: does the life saved in the near term justify methods that may corrode the law that protects the many in the long term? There is no single definitive answer.
Democracies wrestle with this question by trying to balance oversight and secrecy, by setting red lines, and, at times, by re-examining those lines when practices drift. The operation's defenders point to the tangible outcomes: attacks that did not happen, plans that were halted. Its critics point to the erosive effect on humanitarian neutrality and on the rule of law. The story of July 17, 2019, the truck that promised water and carried danger, ends, for now, in ambiguity. Ahmad's interrogation produced intelligence that prevented immediate harm. The tactics used during that interrogation remain a matter of dispute. Some accounts suggest coercive intensity and point to sedation as a controversial element, while others defend the measures as necessary in a time-sensitive operation. The use of humanitarian cover, though operationally effective, raised alarms across aid communities. Diplomatic and legal aftershocks moved through corridors of power and into public debate. If there is a moral to be drawn from these events, it is a frayed, complex one. The same ingenuity that allows a state to prevent violence can also, if unbounded, erode the moral and legal foundations that justify state authority. The choices made in a single seismic moment, to stop a courier, to seize papers, to press for answers, ricochet. They save lives. They also risk the trust that helps those lives endure. We close not with a tidy resolution, but with a question. When prevention requires secrecy and deception, who holds the watch over the watchers? The answer lies in the uneasy architecture of oversight, in laws, in courts, in public debate, and in the professional ethics of those who operate in shadows. The story of the water truck in Sinai is a contained operation and a larger lesson. It is a testament to the capacities of intelligence. It is also a warning about the costs that do not always appear on the balance sheet. If this account spoke to you and you want deeper material, annotated timelines, document summaries, and expert essays, subscribe to the channel for further episodes and a linked reading list. Share this story with someone who follows intelligence, humanitarian issues, or ethics. The conversation it opens is one that affects more than spies and states. It affects communities, aid workers, and the fragile infrastructures of trust in conflict zones.